welcome to ELT in Chile, a podcast about teaching English in Chile. In this space, Kevin and I talk to teachers, teacher trainings, and academics who like to share their experience and expertise in various aspects of English language teaching in Chile and globally. So in this video episode, we will discuss a topic that has really caught our attention: Corpus Linguistics for curriculum design and pedagogical grammar as well. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Graham Burton. So thank you, Graham, for being here.
Thanks a lot for the invite. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So Kevin.
Thank you very much, Graham. Graham Burton is an assistant professor at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy. He has worked in English language teaching and applied linguistics for about 25 years as a teacher, teacher trainer, materials author and editor, and researcher. He has taught in the UK, Italy, and Greece. His main research interests are applications of corpus linguistics to language teaching, materials development, pedagogic grammar, academic writing, and multilingualism. He is the author of the books Corpus Linguistics for Curriculum Design in Routledge 2025, The Big Beast of English Grammar, an Exploration of Form and Function Conversations, Candlin and Minute 2024 with Chris Jones, and Grammar in ELT and ELT Materials, Evaluating its History and Current Practice in Multilingual Matters 2023, as well as numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. He is also the author of a number of teaching publications, including Personal Best B1+ by Richmond ELT 2017, Cambridge English and Power B1 as co-author, published by Cambridge University Press 2015, and Collins Academic Skills Series, Presenting by HarperCollins 2013. Well, Graham, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Welcome to this podcast from me as well. And if I may dive right into the first question. Your book opens with Corpus Basics, but many language teachers still feel intimidated by Corpus tools. What would you say is the single most important thing a teacher needs to understand about Corpus before they can start using them meaningfully in their practice?
Yeah, I think I would just to preface that, I would say I feel it's a bit of a pity if they do feel intimidated, because I don't think you need to, even as a teacher, because I think you can always quickly get useful information. But I think probably the most important thing to understand would be that if you go to a corpus, it's not just going to give you information. So you go to a corpus typically because you've got a question that needs answering. And then obviously you need to therefore know how to use the corpus to get the answer to the question that you want to ask. But I think if you went onto a corpus, some kind of corpus platform, and just tried to play around, you might find it a little bit interesting, but you'd probably think, oh, yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with all this. But that is partly because you don't actually have a question that you're trying to investigate a little bit. So I think that's the important thing to realize, that they don't automatically kind of pump out information to you. You've got to go to them with a particular question in mind.
No, that's very true. Like when I talk to teachers who haven't really used corpus methods before, they have this, I don't know if overwhelmed is the right word, but I think it's really difficult to pin down the reasons for why they should use a corpus and for what, because like it is quite ample. You can use a corpus for so many things, but also a corpus is quite useless on its own, in the sense of if I don't know what I'm looking for, it's really difficult to access. And that's something to get across to teachers that's really difficult to explain unless you have a really good working example. I don't know how you feel about that, Graham.
No, completely. And so, I mean, I think if you wanted to, I years ago I can remember, because I worked in a language school that encouraged us to use, we had a computer room. We're talking like 15 years ago at least, had a computer room, and we were encouraged to go and take the learners there, for a few lessons to do stuff. So I even used corporate with them. But I think if you were doing that, or with teachers, it would help to go with a kind of a set of activities that you want them to work through. And I used to have that. I had a few worksheets of things like that, and with a variety of things, getting them to look at collocations. I think also, it's always useful to get, if you're working with teachers like this or students, get them to make the prediction first, because that's the interesting thing. Yes. So, what do you think the most common words are before whatever the word is, and then go and check. And then you normally get those, things that they hadn't thought of. Or I can remember one thing was the difference between rent and hire. because they're synonyms. But then go and look on a corpus and see, just get concordance lines, and just manually going through them, you start to notice, oh yeah, they're not exactly the same. They tend to use one to talk about some things and the other one to talk about other things. So a kind of a nice set of reasonably easy to do activities, but that kind of work and will generate maybe some surprises. I think that kind of thing helps.
No, that's actually a really good point. And if I may ask, maybe this, I'm not sure if that's a long or a short question, where the question itself is relatively short, but the answer may be long or may be short. What would you think have been the most impactful changes that corpus linguistics has generated in English language teaching over the past? It's been around for about 30 years now.
Yeah, I mean, you might say it's been a lot longer than that, because there were some kind of non-computerized corpora that had been created. And in the first half of the 20th century, there were grammarians like Fries that were, I mean, he had his own telephone corpus he created manually. And would consult manually to inform his grammars, to make sure that they were, reflecting genuine spoken outputs. But yeah, in terms of more modern computerized corpora, actually, in terms of English language teaching, I mean, my mind tends to go towards kind of materials and published materials when I think about this kind of question. And I suppose the first thing we started to see was probably stuff about learner errors. So having learner corpora and then being able to search them for common errors and then feed that back into the materials. Because, I mean, I think that's not a new idea. I think teachers obviously been doing that for a very long time. But then if you've got a learner corpus which you can search, you can really find not just what are the teachers' kind of bugbears, because teachers tend to have their favorite errors that, that we're always ready to correct. You can actually find the ones that are really occurring again and again. I think another thing would be very much, definitely would be vocabulary selection, because it was dictionaries. And I think it was really the learner dictionaries that led the way on this, that they were really the big publications that immediately jumped on the kind of the corpus bandwagon. I guess in the 80s it was, and I think it probably corpora appealed to lexicographers because I think they were kind of working that way anyway, in terms of looking for empirical data. And so having corpora available. And so then I think it started probably to inform definitions, but then you could give frequency information within the dictionary and you could show collocations and things like that. And I think it wasn't a big leap then to see that going into general English materials. And then I'd say slightly more recently, this is a trickier one, but the ordering of content. The two big resources, which are the Cambridge, I say Cambridge, I don't think they're actually officially Cambridge. So the English Grammar Profile and the English Vocabulary Profile. So it was the English Profile Project, which was mainly a Cambridge thing with other partners. So when I was writing teaching materials for Cambridge, for example, also with learner errors. So I was fed in as an author from the editorial team. I was fed in common errors to cover, and we also, there was something with the vocabulary syllabus, which I can't even remember exactly the detail, but I was certainly being fed in words in terms of, or being told to use English Vocabulary Profile to decide what should be included in a text or not included in a text at a particular level. And then, so that the thing is, what I subsequently discovered was that other publishers were also using it, because it was always open access, the English Vocabulary Profile. And I can remember as well being able to settle an argument in that book that you mentioned at the beginning, Personal Best, with Richmond, where they wanted me. I was writing, so that was the intermediate level, B1 plus. And I think it was present perfect continuous, and they wanted me to include something, and I didn't, because it was getting too much in a lesson. And I was able to win the argument by saying, well, look at the English Grammar Profile. And that seems to be a usage that learners are able to produce at B2 level. And immediately they back down. Oh, okay, well,
You have some evidence.
Sounded like a very, evidence. And they were very, there's kind of seemed to be like a trustworthy resource. But I don't know how widespread it's happening because, I mean, I guess if you're not Cambridge University Press, you're not going to be advertising the fact that you're doing it because perhaps you're not even allowed to, because to get a commercial license for it maybe would be another thing. But I'm sure it's happening informally.
Yeah.
I think beyond that, there's what are sometimes called the indirect applications, because if you're, I mean, an individual author might be aware of other research, other resources that are themselves corpus informed, and so then they might then use them in their own writing, which obviously that relies more on the individual author or editor being aware of that and knowing the research, or being able to do corpus research. But there are a few examples as well. I'm thinking people like Mike McCarthy, who wrote the Touchstone series. So the Touchstone has various corpus informed elements. Randy Reppen is another example of an author who's also an academic and has used corpus data. And in fact, in the Corpus Linguistics for Curriculum Design book, in the second chapter, I was able to put together, I think, 5 or 6 little contributions, including by Mike McCarthy and Randy Reppen, where they describe how they use corpora to design or to inform, I should say, the curriculum of a particular publication. So it's patchy, I think, I would say overall. And I would say probably most of all vocabulary and learner errors is where it's had the biggest influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Kevin, I don't know if you would like to add anything.
No, thank you very much. At this point, no.
All right. Well, on your chapter of, let's say, on lexigram, so you raise the issue of frequency problems and limitations, because let's say myself, I've seen that there are like frequency lists dominate so much the, let's say, material design. What are the risks of relying on frequency, let's say, lists so much or too heavily? And what do you think that designers should do, people who design, let's say, materials, use besides, frequency lists?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk is always the same, and because it's not just, anytime you look at frequency data, the risk is that you focus on things that are frequent but are not necessarily immediately useful for learners.
Yeah.
And that also depends on the corpus that you're using, of course, because you want the corpus to be representative of whatever domain of use that you're thinking about in terms of creating materials. But even if you've got that right, there is still always the question, well, because it's frequent, does it mean that it's, let's say, a priority for learners?
Yeah.
And like I said, it's not just vocabulary. I mean, there's some, I think, some very open questions, because if you think as well about grammar structures as well, I've heard it argued, for example, people saying, well, the so-called third conditional, it's so infrequent, why do we bother teaching it? But then you think, well, if it's so infrequent, then the learners are least likely to be exposed to it. So maybe it needs actually more time than less time. And the stuff that's most frequent that they're going to be coming across all the time, perhaps that you don't need to focus on that so much in class. So that's, I think, very much an open question. With vocabulary, yes, the same thing. I think there's been quite a strong response to that really from the beginning. In the book, I talk about, I think I came up with this phrase, but I'm not sure, but how often you find there's a kind of pedagogical filter that's been used. So in the creation of a frequency list, I mean, I don't think anyone's really ever looking at a pure frequency list. There's always some kind of filtering process, which might be to exclude words that are not of interest, or, I mean, that happens particularly in English for specific purposes lists, where you might exclude the non-specific word. So you might work with a general word list, and in producing your ESP word list, you might automatically exclude the words from the general word list, which also leads to other potential problems. But so that would be one kind of pedagogical filter. I know there's an interesting paper which I reference in the book from Oxford University Press, because they created some word lists, and they point out that there are some words that are not necessarily very frequent overall in most corpora, but are probably very frequent in the language classroom. So grammar words or classroom objects or the word exercise. There's all kinds of vocabulary. So I think that is the main response to that kind of problem of just over relying on frequency, is that you kind of have something alongside frequency, some other criteria or criterion for deciding what you actually include in your list.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and also let's say, well, talking about something maybe similar, that sometimes multi-word units, sometimes they tend to be unrepresented, would you say, in language curricula? Do you think that's the case, or do you think that maybe that's sometimes when I see it also in class, like sometimes in the textbook you see a phrase like, I don't know, kick the bucket, and people say like, yeah, but you don't need to maybe teach that, or by and large, or let's say some other expressions or idioms or phrasal verbs. So do you think that they are also like unrepresented in a way?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the first example you give, because this is the problem with multi-word units, is that when you try and just think of them, your mind tends to go towards the idiomatic.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas, and I think I mentioned in this book, there was Mike McCarthy, one of the examples he gave is referring to the corpus that he created with Ron Carter, the CAN code corpus, which is a corpus of spoken English, quite old now, it's from the 90s. But he found that the phrase "or something like that" as a phrase was more frequent than the words breakfast and the word slow as well. So even though it's a 4-word chunk, which tends to be the longer the string, the less frequent it becomes. That "or something like that" is so frequent that it's more frequent than these other presumably very frequent words. So I think that's part of the problem, which is that if you just try and think, we shouldn't just be teaching single words, let's teach some multi-word units, and then you come up with kick the bucket and rain cats and dogs and all that kind of stuff. So and that doesn't necessarily feel very useful. I mean, it may be fun for a single lesson, maybe idioms, vocabulary focused idioms, and you teach 8 or 10 or something like that, but it doesn't really feel very useful. I think the other reason it maybe is underrepresented is just because it's like it's a whole other layer of vocabulary, right? You feel you've dealt with the single words, and now I've got to deal with 3-word or 4-word
multi-words.
chunks.
Yes.
Yeah, and obviously you can't teach everything as well. You're always going to be selective. I think the first thing I would say is yes, they should be kind of. This is where a corpus would really help, because you can very quickly. This is one of the things I was thinking of at the beginning when you asked me, what can a teacher, what could they, if they feel intimidated by a corpus, that's a thing you could do very quickly, is generate 3-word or 4-word strings very quickly from a corpus, at least with some platforms, and get a list of quite useful language often. And I think it feels useful when you see it. Not always, but a lot of it feels useful, far more than kick the bucket and stuff like that. So I think that would be helpful to start with that kind of information. So starting with this kind of corpus-formed informed information, or corpus-generated lists of multi-word units. But then I guess the question would be, do you need to teach them explicitly? Because perhaps you would just make sure that they're present in input materials, whether that's texts or kind of listening scripts and things like that. But I would say, if you've got a curriculum which is really aiming to develop spoken fluency, for example, I mean, it also could be written. I think in teaching writing, we're kind of used to actually teaching multi-word units. It's more probably in spoken language that it's less common. So I think, it would be worth definitely looking at the most frequent ones. So things like that, or something like that, those kind of chunks that just appear again and again, because they are going to be useful, or at very least make sure they're there in the recordings that the students listen to.
Yes.
That's very interesting. From my own research, I think it's interesting to see that those little conversational items or conversational chunks are not very common, unfortunately, right? So in that aspect, I think teachers, course designers, they can really draw on corpus linguistics, because I would, if I hadn't done the research and someone would say, well, what are the little chunks that you use in conversation? I would be like, I don't know. I don't think I talk like that. And then, oh, if you heard a recording of yourself, well, you do talk like that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think there's quite something in there for that. Moving on a little bit though, in the grammar chapter, you discuss learner corpora and learner errors, right? Which is super interesting. And I wonder, how should a corpus designer balance what the expert input that a corpus, a native speaker corpus or an expert language user corpus, tells us, and how can we use this to be matched with what learners actually can produce, based on learner corpus research? Does that question make sense?
Yes. So
Right.
how would you balance that? How would you balance the two things?
Exactly.
To be honest, do you know, I would make it even more complex, and I would add a third thing here, which is how do you also balance the information about the information we have on what students do well? So not just what they find difficult and what they struggle with, what do they do well?
Yeah.
And then I'd also think, well, what does struggling mean? Because struggling makes you think, well, maybe they make an error.
Yeah.
But what we know from research, not corpus research particularly, but from research, is that students will avoid certain structures to avoid making the error, especially in certain contexts like exam situations. So they will avoid, to avoid making an error, they just won't produce something. So that could also be a sign of struggling. So I think there's kind of three things then. So yeah, there's the expert language use, which might be native speakers or highly competent non-native speakers. There's errors, but there's also things that learners, so errors and avoidance. And then also, but what actually can they do? What do learners do well? Which is what you can see in something like the English grammar profile. I think overall, I wouldn't let one focus dominate. I think most learners probably do want kind of an expert model to aim for. And that is often going to be a native speaker as well, a native speaker model. Obviously, we know the problems with that. But one thing I've always thought, and this, especially in my own language learning kind of experiences, for me, that talking to someone and hearing someone who's just a bit better than you, or quite a bit better than you, but not like completely other end of the scale, is so useful. So, and it's happened to me several times in different languages I've learned, when you just get the chance to speak to someone who's a bit better than you. And that's something you can do, for example, in these resources that are these corpus, these learner-based. So something like the English grammar profile or the English vocabulary profile, they're not focusing on error, they're focusing on competence. That's the whole idea. What can learners do at these different levels? And I think that's really kind of powerful and motivating. So if I'm at B1 and I can see what learners can do at B1 plus or B2, for me, that's really interesting. What can they do that I can't do now? Rather than a native speaker, because we know that the native speaker can do everything, right? But just seeing someone who's a bit better than me, and that's my target, I think it's kind of motivating, but it's also very accessible, right? You feel you can make that jump. So that's something also to consider, as well as what are they not doing, which you can see by kind of comparing. This is one of the two things that are often looked for when you're looking at learner corpus data is misuse, overuse, and underuse. So there's three things. So that's another thing. Are they overusing something, which might mean they're not using the alternative? Are they just not using something, so they may be avoiding it, or they don't know it? And are they misusing it, which is the error? So those things are important. A native speaker model, but I also do really like this idea of seeing what's at the next level above from you, and kind of signposting that as well, just to say this is where you've got to go. I think it's useful.
Yeah. I think, there's also kind of, I'm not sure if it prevents the idea from being overwhelmed, but it almost chops up the progress, the journey, into smaller, more digestible pieces, right? So to help perhaps also prevent plateauing, help getting up to that point where you feel you're not making any progress, to actually see the performance of other people who are either at your stage or just higher, slightly above you. Yeah, I really like the way you explained this, Graham.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're actually faced with that. Let's say at university here, when people usually ask you the question, what do I need to improve, or how can I improve? And sometimes like usually say like maybe this like in terms of collocations, maybe, or something that has to do with the next question, because many students are, I see them carrying like, I don't know, a grammar book, like let's say something that's more traditional. So, and then we start discussing things like pattern grammar, or like we like to move away a little bit from like traditional grammar. And sometimes I feel that this concept is not really, or it's not part of like mainstream teaching training. How would you explain like this practical value of maybe pattern grammar, Graham, to a teacher who's never encountered this idea, especially like nowadays when people need to, let's say, know, or moving from, as Kevin was saying, from this plateau of like, okay, how can I improve them, maybe to be more, to have like more advanced vocabulary, or maybe more advanced, let's say, grammar structures in a way.
Yeah, the idea of advanced grammar structures is interesting, and
yes.
I think it was Mike McCarthy wrote about that a couple of times, where as it seems like historically, when the grammar kind of syllabus was developed, we kind of ran out of ideas a little bit as we got to the upper intermediate and advanced level, because what you tend to do is just get more and more obscure stuff.
Yes.
Whereas, but again, you look at the English grammar profile, and at C1 level, the things that seem to be making the difference are not necessarily the obscure stuff. It's the stuff that the learners already know, but they're just doing it better, or they're using something that they already know in a different context rather than something completely new.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, pattern grammar is also, that's an interesting example of that.
Yeah.
So how would I explain the significance? I mean, teachers probably know, because most course books around kind of intermediate level, they have this famous verb combination. So you might get that twice.
Yeah.
So verb plus to plus infinitive, or verb plus ing.
Yeah.
And then the ones where it can be both, like stop or remember and things like that. I mean, those are patterns, right?
Yes.
But for some reason, that's all we do in standard ELT grammar. It's just when you've got two verbs, how do you decide on the form of the second verb? So I think if you could explain to teachers, well, it's just like that, but you realize it's not just a verb plus verb phenomenon, that you get this kind of patterned nature of language in other situations, and you get it with nouns, and you get it with adjectives. You can find these different
nouns, yes.
kinds of patterns, but with adjective plus preposition, all this kind of thing. So I think extending from that idea, which is probably familiar to them. I think another thing, I remember when I first started teaching, I remember this point, I guess this was probably in the second year of teaching, where I was trying to correct a written text.
Yeah.
And it was probably it was intermediate level. And I can remember seeing errors and thinking, I don't know why this is wrong. And I had done a degree in linguistics, and so I kind of thought I was pretty competent. And although I hadn't done anything to do with pedagogical grammar when I'd studied, I kind of picked that up quite reasonably easily, because it was familiar to me. Which for native speaker teachers, as they typically start teaching, they kind of don't know anything about it. And I mean, I didn't really, except I had the preparation in linguistics, so it was easy to start picking up the pedagogical grammar rules. But even that, I still was like, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know how to explain why this is wrong, but it was patterns. And I reflected on it later. I realized, these are mistakes with patterns, and there's not a particular overarching rule that I could explain, or I could have used to explain what the problem was. It was just, he didn't know, this particular writer, how, I don't remember what the errors were, but the wider pattern with this verb or with this preposition or with this adjective, you got it wrong. And there wasn't a particular rule for that. You just had to know that pattern for that particular word. So I think that's another reason why it's relevant and perhaps would be of interest to teachers.
Yeah, I think we can come up with a new term, obscure grammar, or obscure patterns of grammar, of English grammar, because absolutely. I think I agree with that point with and I think the idea of maybe what Kevin was saying, plateauing, because students get that many times, how can I move forward? What else can I do? And I think we need to go back to okay, this is something that you're managing well. Let's see what actually we can do to actually improve this, more than including some, I don't know, more complicated, obscure rules.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I think also students are quite receptive to these ideas. What I've done recently, I'm currently teaching a class in listening and speaking, and for the speaking, where they're preparing for the Cambridge Advanced. at the end of their pedagogy training to show their language proficiency, right? And one of the big questions that we've been trying to answer for the past 4 or 5 months, perhaps, was, well, we have a certified B2. What do I need to do? Because they're all fluent enough. They speak English really well.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do we actually need to do to get to that C1? What is it? Because we understand, we
English
can speak, but we always get marked down for interactive skills, for discourse marking. And what I did, I printed out 2 transcripts from a language test, from an oral test. One was at B2, the other one was at C1. I gave it to the class. I now go and analyze the differences. What does the C1 speaker do that the B2 speaker doesn't do, or doesn't do quite as much? And that was actually quite an interesting class that we had.
Yeah, it must have been. I mean, that's exactly that, right? It's the next stage. What can they do? What can you do at the next stage that,
you cannot.
Same thing again.
Yeah, and I think the students quite enjoyed that a lot. But yeah, I think it needs to be done more. But then also, like, you need to know about corpus. You need to know about learner corpus research. You need to have access to a learner corpus that is segmented or has subcorpus at different proficiency levels to do a little exercise like that in class, right? But well, moving on a little bit, maybe slightly interconnected, but also quite different. My next question refers to your chapter on pragmatics and discourse, and covers everything from conversation structure to hedging to politeness, right? Your chapter. In your view, which of those areas is the most neglected in current English language curricula, and what are the consequences of that neglect?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get to pragmatics and discourse, I think there's always a variation when you're thinking about general English or English for specific purposes, but that will change massively in terms of what you would focus on in these particular areas. So hedging, for example, is really important in academic writing. So if you know you've got learners going in that direction, then hedging, you might say, well, that's, they don't really get to learn about that most of the time. It's also something that AI is quite well known to be not very good at now. If you get something like ChatGPT to kind of try to revise your text, to improve your text, it will tend to remove the hedging, which is not very helpful at all. So yes, hedging would be something I think, but again, it depends. It depends a little bit what the purpose of the learning is. I think another thing is, one thing I'm working on at the moment is a paper on the language of agreeing and disagreeing. It's in an academic spoken context is what we're looking at. And it all comes still, these are ideas, stuff that came into my head. I remember when I was teaching, which is when you get those little useful language boxes in course books and stuff like that, and how often when you look at them, you think this is actually not very useful language because I don't think I say any of these things. And if you look at the language of agreeing and disagreeing, that's just a classic example of that, because you get all these phrases like, well, I partially agree with you. Or,
they're very explicit, aren't they?
They're very explicit. They're very elaborate. But then you go in a corpus and you look for them and you don't find them. Even the verb, I disagree. The verb to disagree. I mean, you'd think that would be a really classic way of expressing disagreement, but actually we don't say it very much.
It's also like a matter of face keeping, isn't it? Like confronting you with, I think you're wrong, I disagree. It's like
completely
you put your face at threat.
Yes.
Like you're at threat of losing your face or creating a really awkward situation.
Exactly. But even I think the same is perhaps true of agreeing as well, depending on the context, because even agreeing can be slightly face threatening because it can be patronizing, right? You kind of think, well, who are you to explicitly express your agreement with me? Like, I don't need your validation. So, but if you just sit down as a materials author, as a teacher, and think, okay, we're going to practice agreeing and disagreeing, what language will you come up with? Well, it will be that stuff. I totally agree with you. That's a very good point.
Yes.
Yeah, it could be all this stuff. So I think that is something
at scale type of short phrases.
Yeah, classic, yes. But then you look at them and they're just not attested. You just don't find them in the data. So that would perhaps be I think kind of proper corpus informed speech acts are certainly an area that's neglected, because it kind of always looks all right, I guess, until you have to teach it. I can just remember always thinking this, like, why are we, do they need 8 different ways to disagree? And are any of these actually, have I ever said any of these in my life? And you think, okay, no to both questions. So
Yeah, absolutely.
No,
absolutely.
that's a really good point you're making.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, if let's say if we talk about like the next section, which is also something Kevin has done some research, sorry, on this area, which is the idea of maybe spoken grammar, specifically, because sometimes we focus a lot of like maybe traditional grammar or like maybe written grammar. So in this case, would be like, how does spoken English challenge the assumptions built into most grammar syllabi? What does corpus evidence tell us about traditional grammar? Sometimes that traditional grammar misses sometimes, or maybe
I think that
yes,
the principalist kind of assumption that it challenges is probably the idea that grammar descriptions that are primarily based on written forms are sufficient. So in other words, that you can get all the information you need about grammar from sort of looking down at a written text, a text that was written in order to be read, rather than
said.
Yes, so not even a simulated kind of spoken text, but literally. I don't think it's the case that the kind of conventional descriptions of grammar in ELT, I don't think they would ever try to do that. I don't think you don't hear this idea, well, grammar means written grammar. But there's the assumption that still, nonetheless, you can find what you need to know from written data. I saw an interesting example of this a while back. I think it was on Twitter, and when everyone was still on Twitter, and it wasn't even, it was someone from education, but not from ELT. So it was kind of school education. And he was promoting, I guess, oracy in the classroom. So this was, a first language context. And she wrote something like, that she'd been working on this idea of, if you can't say something, then you can't write it. And so I got the idea, right? So it's the idea that the children should be encouraged to kind of express themselves in a sophisticated way, because, otherwise, how can you expect them to write well? But it's completely incorrect. If you can't say something, you can't write it. Well, in fact, there's loads of stuff that we say that we don't write. But equally, there's loads of stuff that we write that we don't say.
Yes.
They're 2 different things. So, like I said, the intention there was good, but I think it's so wrong. So that's what the research on spoken grammar has shown us this, really, that there are valid features of grammar that appear in speech but don't appear in written, or not, at least not very often in written text. And they're not mistakes, and it's not slang. They're just features of spoken language. Another thing I've looked at.
Sorry. I was just thinking about Ruhlemann's 2006 paper, where he promotes the idea of getting rid of disfluency and those little prefixes that suggest that people make an error, that you're not fluent when you produce your occasional or well, which if you look at the data, is just a marker of cognitive processing, which is, I would almost argue, essential for oral production, right? Whilst when I write something, I've got the power of addition, which I do not have when I produce speech, right? So considering both modes as they're interlinked, of course, to some extent, but lumping them together as one skill set, I think, is a fallacy that we need to be very, very aware of as language teachers, right?
Yeah, so one thing I've been looking at recently, it totally comes from the book I wrote with Chris Jones, the Big Beasts of English Grammar. So for that, we were using the spoken BNC 2015 as the corpus, which is a corpus of conversational English, which is important. So there's no monologues in there. It's conversation between people. And I think that as well, we found various features there that can point you towards things that you can't really get at with introspection or looking at written text. So I'm just writing a paper about this now, or writing it together. And one of the examples I went back to was something with going to for predictions. So the classic rule in pedagogical grammar is that we use going to for predictions when we have present evidence. That's what it's normally said. And so the classic example is, look at the clouds, it's going to rain, right?
Yes.
Which is not wrong. But what we found in the conversational data is that there was way more prediction than maybe you'd expect with going to. And this present evidence thing wasn't there. So you think, okay, well, they're just using it. But then you start to realize, no, hang on. There is a kind of evidence, but it's shared knowledge. That's the evidence. So this is one particular example where they're talking about their grandmother, and they're talking about hearing aid, and they say something about not wanting to have they were going to buy one for her or something like that, but it shouldn't have too much amplification because she's not going to be able to change the volume. So she's not going to be, it was something like that, not going to be able to. So what does that mean? There's no present evidence because they don't have the grandma there. She's not trying to do it or anything like that. But
they've got this shared understanding about the
grandmother, about her, maybe some physical kind of difficulties with small buttons or something like that. And so, but that you can't get to unless you consider conversational data.
Yeah.
And so you're just kind of adding some information there about, I think, a reasonable pedagogical rule that we make when we make predictions with present evidence. We use going to rather than will, for example. But in this case, it's not just that. It's this idea of, which is really what present evidence is, right? It's the shared knowledge, because I can see the clouds, you can see the clouds, but it's just, it doesn't have to be something you can see.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. I think that's a very interesting point, especially like challenging the assumptions of, like things that, when we are trying to maybe describe, a specific type of grammar, but then you have those examples. And of course, then we've got exceptions, and that's why maybe corpus informed materials can actually help us.
Yeah.
So Kevin.
That is super interesting, and links in quite well with the research that I'm doing, that we're doing here. But zooming out a little bit and looking at the field as a whole, corpus linguistics, corpus informed pedagogy, they've come a long way, right, over the past 3 decades, 4 decades, perhaps, in the current shape that they are. What do you think is the next frontier for this area of applied linguistics, especially now that I was going to say have entered the area of AI, but actually we are right bang on in the middle of AI, because you can't avoid it even if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So where next? What's corpus linguistics going to do? What would you predict?
To predict, I mean, I guess I could talk about hopes.
All right.
Yes. That's always good in current times. Let's talk about hopes.
Hopes, yes.
I mean, I suppose you say, yes, there's been a lot of progress and a lot of findings, but I mean, you asked me at the beginning what influence it's had on ELT.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's patchy and limited in some ways. So it would be nice. I would hope that somehow the link between, I mean, we say this about everything, right? Research and practice is improved, but I think Bethany Gray gave a plenary at a conference a couple of years ago, and she was pointing out how often researchers will say things like in the abstract of an article that they're going to discuss pedagogical implications, and it turns out to be a sentence or a couple of sentences, and says, well, this will be of interest to materials designers and curriculum designers and things like that, but you're not saying how. You're not really saying. It's always as if that's just their job. And it was interesting when I did my master's. I'd worked in publishing for a couple of years when I did my master's, so I'd worked in ELT publishing. And then I did the master's, and that was really when I first studied corpus linguistics. And I saw this kind of assumption always in not always, but in a lot of articles. Well, we've got these findings, and somehow they're just going to be picked up. Then a few years' time, it's inevitable. There'll be in all the course books, this thing that I've just found, and it just doesn't happen because the interface isn't there. But it's not just a lack of interface. I think you just have to do a bit more as a researcher. I think you have to give some examples, produce some example activities, really make the case for it, because people aren't just going to pick up on something that you've
Mm-hmm.
published in a journal and stick it
Yeah.
in a teaching publication. I suppose that you mentioned AI. That's already been integrated into some Corpus software.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a challenge to see if it will really work. And there are some people who say, yeah, it definitely works. And some people who are very kind of angry about the idea. I mean, one of the interesting things about AI, I mean, here we should specify we're talking about generative AI.
Generative AI, yes.
It's similar in some parts to a corpus in the sense that it has large amounts of language data and it uses that data as a basis for something. So in corpus linguistics, we use these collections of data to represent language, whereas I would say Gen AI does that also to represent language, but also to represent knowledge, right? Because that's what it's throwing back out. So obviously with Gen AI, there's also complex software which generates the language, which corpus software doesn't do at all. I think, a question that some people have been asking is, well, whether we will just give up on corpora and if we can just ask, and since Gen AI is based on huge amounts of language data, could we just ask ChatGPT or whatever to answer the questions that we would have asked as corpus linguists? And I think the research that I've seen where people have kind of done that as an experiment has shown so far that it doesn't work that well. And I think the other thing is, which I think you will never have with Gen AI, at least in its current state, is you've got this 100% transparency of corpus data. Because you know where the data's come from. I mean, if you have a huge corpus, it's problematic, like, billions of words. You don't exactly know where they've got that from, but still, when you do your analysis and you get your output, it's 100% replicable. You can go into the corpus and find exactly where in the corpus you've got examples of the thing that you think you found or whatever, in a way that, I mean, you can ask ChatGPT to do that, but it just will never really tell you because it doesn't know. Well, at least yes, it doesn't. Well, it doesn't know anything, but its output is not designed to be able to give you that transparency. So, and you can't go into the training data in the way that you can with data from a corpus. So I think there's still a big role for corpora from that point of view, just because they provide that transparency and I would say kind of reliability in a lot of ways, because you can just look under the hood. You can go straight into the corpus and find the underlying data in a way that Gen AI just doesn't let you do.
Yes. It's not really, let's say, well transparent. Yes, Kevin.
No, I think this is a really nice high note to finish on. I agree with that to that extent, that Gen AI also, we don't know anything. And I did a little, it's not a published experiment, but I did a little bit just to pass time, shall we say, where I asked ChatGPT to compile a frequency list based on COCA and based on the BNC 2014. And I had this frequency list compiled, explained, and analyzed. And then I did the same as a human researcher. And those lists I mean, they were, interestingly, relatively close to each other. So you had your the, I, you, and so on, as you would expect. But the frequency ranks and the order of occurrence was so far off. So I think like this, I don't know if that's a hallucination or if that's just what ChatGPT, well, I don't want to say thinks because it doesn't do specifically that. But it is misleading, isn't it? And it doesn't necessarily show you what you expect, although it does look like it is what I'm looking for, although it's not really, it doesn't allow me to perform the same searches as corpus linguistics, and it's by far, I would say, not as empirically validatable as a corpus search, right?
Yes, unless it's got another layer of some other kind of plugin, where if you ask it to tell you, frequencies or things like that, it's not going to go and count anything. It's just going to give you a probabilistic answer. And there's no difference really between, this is my understanding of it as obviously a non-expert, but when a Gen AI hallucinates, that's not a mistake. That's what it's supposed to be doing. The hallucination is like at our end. We perceive the hallucination. For the generative AI, it's just producing probabilistically, right?
Yeah. It's statistically correct.
It's completely valid output, but we're the ones who can compare it to kind of real life and say, no, that's hallucination, that's not real, but it's actually working as it's supposed to work. And but again, that's part of the problem with it. It will tell you it's counted, right? It will give you these
and it's convincing.
Specific numbers.
Yeah. It's very convincing.
But it's not counting anything. It's just giving you a probable number. So.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, let's say, experts come in and we can actually tell that's, let's say, well, true or false, or maybe if it's correct or incorrect in a way. But yeah, absolutely. So, Graham, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for, for your interesting answers. And now we have to, think and, continue to see how ELT, field is going to evolve. So with this, we're going to conclude our, let's say, today's episode with Graham Burton. So thank you very much. And we would strongly recommend checking his book, Corpus Linguistics for Curriculum Design. And again, if you have any questions or comments, you can reach us at our own email address, podcast@eltinchile.com. And of course, we have our own website where you can, check our past episodes and everything that, let's say, people have shared with us. So www.eltinchile.com. Kevin, thank you very much. And Graham, again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it.